Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm Alina Cohen, I'm the Director of Communications here at Lake Gallery. We're so excited to have this conversation with Won Ju Lim on the final day of her show with us, An Artificial Place. I'll read the bios of each of our speakers today, and then we'll have a conversation followed by some Q&A, so start thinking of your questions. 2024 Guggenheim Fellow, Won Ju Lim's work has been exhibited worldwide in over 40 solo and over 70 group exhibitions. Her work is included in international public collections such as those of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, San Jose Museum of Art, Manetti Shrem Museum of Art, and many more. Graham Harman is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Sidecar. His most recent books are Architecture and Objects, University of Minnesota Press, 2022, and Objects Untimely, Object-Oriented Philosophy and Archaeology, with Christopher Whitmore, Paul Press, 2023. Daniel Tovar is an artist and educator living in Los Angeles. He is liberal arts faculty at Sci-Arc and a board member of Monte Vista Projects. His multidisciplinary work, incorporating audio, video, and sculpture, has been exhibited and performed in Monte Vista Projects, Wandsworth Gallery, Coaxial Arts Foundation, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, among others. If you do want more information about the show afterwards, we have press releases, checklists, and the script for the video on the white link back there. And we have Madeline's donuts, water outside. Enjoy.
I thought I'd just start out by asking you, Won Ju, about the show overall, and in particular your focus on Proust. What drew you to Proust initially, and in particular what drew you to such that you were motivated to make work about him? Because I know not just the work in this show, but other work that I've seen is also inspired by Proust.
Thank you for the introduction, Alina, and of course thank you both for agreeing to be here. Okay, so Proust. I mean, I was introduced to Proust by a graduate advisor of mine many decades ago, not that many, but a few decades ago, as a young artist. I was introduced to Proust by Salvador Laforgue. I think some of you guys are very familiar with him and his writings and his mind. And so I made this piece, my very first art piece, titled Proustian Bedroom, which is a series of elevation drawings and floor plan drawings onto my studio, onto the walls and onto the floor. And he came and did a studio visit, and he said, well, you must read Proust. So I was, not an older person, but I was not that young. Until then, I was not aware of Proust at all. And within the first few pages, I was immediately attracted to his mind. And I think it has something to do with the way he describes objects, things in the world, people, places, and they're all interchangeable. And that is something that I was immediately drawn to. And in so many ways, it's not so much that I was seeking Proust. I think a Proustian sensibility was also seeking me. And when we met, it was like love at first sight. Another thing that I think that maybe I was attracted to a Proustian sensibility because at a young age, I knew of things in the world through two languages. I mean, I'm not the only bilingual person, right? But it was something about certain words that exist in Korean that was not translatable in English, or very ordinary things. This thing has two names to me. It was something that was, I didn't think about it, of course, as a child, but I think that way of learning new things and new ideas was something that was, that I was used to. And then when I read Proust, it just made sense. The world made sense.
One of the things that I was struck by just coming into the gallery is the, of course, walls of shadows that you're greeted with. And I sort of had this sense of the Wizard of Oz. You sort of have this big spectacle on the wall, and then you're invited to come look at these things that are responsible for the spectacle. Sort of are able to push the curtain to the side and see behind it, see the things that are responsible for that spectacle. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the objects that are making all these shadows in these pieces.
And so kind of, first of all, I see the shadows as, I'm not sure if equal is the right term, but I see, I don't see a hierarchy, or I don't approach the shadows versus the objects as in kind of hierarchical relationship. I think that they're equally present, that they have equal agencies. And so, yes, but it is, these objects and the shadows are a result of my memory of reading Proust. And that's also based on his memory of things that happen. And of course, there's language and way to narratify some kind of events that's in the literature that I hope I'm not translating or illustrating, but that I'm creating a Proustian world through a creative process of some sort.
Just to pick up on one of the things you said about the shadows being sort of on the same level as the objects on the platters. I think when Graham and I first walked in here, one of the things he mentioned, one of the people he mentioned was Plato. And of course, for Plato, that sort of cuts against what Plato says about shadows. And I wonder, Graham, if you could say something about Plato and how we might think about the object sort of in light of the allegory of the cave.
Right. A lot of people are familiar with the allegory of the cave from a philosophy class, I'm sure, but for those who are not, in Plato's Republic, Socrates tells the myth of some prisoners chained in a cave since birth who can only look at the wall and see shadows, but of course they don't realize there's anything beyond the shadows in their world. Until at one point, one of the people in the cave breaks free from his chains, goes out into the outer world, and at first can only look at reflections in the water because his eyes are not used to the bright sun outside. And finally, he can look at the objects themselves and eventually at the sun, the cause of all the shadows. And it's interesting that in this work, if we link it to Plato, and I agree with you, there shouldn't be a hierarchy, but for Plato there is. We are not in the position of, even though it's shadowy in here, we are not in the position of the prisoners, we are in the position of the philosophers here, because we can see the real objects and the shadows. But before you get too flattered by that, what happens in the myth is the philosopher goes back into the cave to tell the prisoners that all they're seeing are shadows, the real world's outside, and they kill him. And this is supposed to be a metaphor for Socrates having been essentially lynched by the Athenian jury, which condemned him to death. So that's one of the two philosophical links to this show. The other one, I think equally important, is the philosophy of Henri Bergson, whose name looks like Henry Bergson, if you didn't catch my pronunciation. And the connections between Bergson and Proust run very deep indeed, and there's two. One of them is that they're both very interested in time and memory, and for Bergson, he does have a kind of hierarchy where the flowing experience of subjective consciousness is somehow for him superior to the abstract mathematical world of space, which you can measure and quantify. And he thinks the biggest mistake you can make is trying to, there's an incommensurability between those two realms, and you shouldn't try to judge one in terms of the other. And so he has this problem of finding where the interface between the two is. And he calls that endosmosis, he also calls it simultaneity. But the other connection with Proust, which is interesting, and many people don't know it, is that Bergson's wife, Louise, was the cousin of Marcel Proust. both important figures in the Paris Jewish community at the time. And the direction of influence would have gone from Bergson to Proust, because Bergson was writing his first books in the 1890s, flourishing up until maybe about 1910 before he started falling out of public view. And of course, Proust's novels are a bit later than that. But Bergson's discussions of time, which are profound, did have a huge influence on Proust. There's one last irony, though, which is that Proust is always on the short list of how didn't he win the Nobel Prize in Literature, along with James Joyce and a few others, Borges. But Bergson did win the Nobel Prize in Literature as a philosopher. He and Bertrand Russell are the two philosophers I can think of who have won it, and Bergson deserved it. The beautiful metaphors he uses, and so forth. And the last connection I want to make is that both Proust and Bergson were again tied together in the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, who has been very big in the English-speaking world since 1995. And he wrote an early book on Proust called Proust and Science, and then a later book on Bergson called Bergsonism. And so Deleuze ties this together. I don't know if he was an influence on your show at all, but certainly Proust and Bergson are two of his main influences.
Yeah. So I was initially talking about when Proust was introduced to me, and these kind of terms, but of course, Deleuze, Bergson, either you're conjuring up all kinds of memories of the times that I had at Art Center as a graduate student. You know, so these philosophers, thinkers were very much talked about at the time, and this is the 90s. And mid-90s, and yes, so I am familiar with them to a certain degree, and I also try very hard not to keep them in mind so much in the studio. And so in thinking about my work, I hope that I could interpret or look at my work objectively through the minds of thinkers, through these thinkers. One of the things I was very much interested in, especially with this work, and maybe some of my other works that have to do with shadows, projections onto objects, but this work is how Bergson talks about the image. You know, that the image is not a representation of something, that the image is not a representation of an existing object. I think he says something like that is more than a representation, but less than a thing, or something like that. And I really like this way of understanding things in the world, and especially an image, not a picture, not a print, not something you see on your phone, but an image, one that kind of perhaps lives in the mind's eye, and one that is somehow has a role in memory, one to kind of like rethink about. And especially in relationship to the agency of the shadow.
I want to say, Won Ju, congratulations on this piece, which I saw for the first time about 10 days ago, and it made a great first impression on me, but I've been thinking about it every day ever since. And now it's new aspects of it are coming out for me as I think about it. I should say that most philosophers, you know, there is aesthetics in philosophy. It's one of the branches of philosophy. But George Santayana, the Spanish-American philosopher, wrote in the 1890s that beauty is a relatively minor part of philosophy, but it's a major part of everyday life. We're constantly making aesthetic decisions, ranging from what to put on in the morning, what haircut to get, which way to walk to work. These are governed by aesthetic decisions. And if I can focus on that word beauty for a second, the reason I do is because that word has become somewhat embarrassing to people in art and architecture. Maybe it's the Duchampian influence since the 60s, where he railed against what he called retinal art. He wanted art that makes us think. And so you don't hear people talking about beauty. You hear scientists and mathematicians talking about beauty now. For mathematicians, the fact that an equation is beautiful, or a theorem, a proof of the theorem is beautiful, are almost automatic arguments in its favor. And high-level physics, there's even the criticism that beauty has become too much of a criterion. I'm reading Sabina Hossenfelder's book now called Lost in Math, where she is saying the problem with contemporary physics is it's too focused on the beauty of Einstein's equations, or in biology, the beauty of the DNA double helix, that these are taking too much as criteria. But I want to say, I think aesthetics is at the dead center of philosophy, and that's a rare opinion. And the reason I think this is that the privilege of knowledge in philosophy, I think, goes to the time of the scientific revolution 400 years ago. That philosophers, especially in the analytic tradition, want to be scientists. They admire scientists more than anyone else. Scientists are discovering real things, and philosophers go around in a circle debating the same things for centuries at a time. So there's this idea that science makes progress. However, I don't think philosophy or art are forms of knowledge. I think they show us a form of cognition that is not a form of knowledge. What's wrong with knowledge? Well, there are really two kinds of knowledge. Only two. I've thought about this for years. If someone asks you what something is, there are two things you can do. You can tell them what it's made of, or you can tell them what it does. If you tell them what it's made of, you're reducing it downward to the pieces that make it up, or the back history. If you tell them what it's made of, you're reducing upward to the effects it has on you or on other things. What both of those things do is they miss the middle ground, which is the thing itself, which is more than its pieces, it's emergent, and it's less than its effects, because a thing is always capable of more effects than it's having right now. So where philosophy and the arts overlap, I think, is an interest in that middle ground. Socrates always says that he knows nothing. He's never been anyone's teacher. And this isn't just irony. He finds it, people always think of Socrates as searching for definitions of things. They forget that he never finds any. That every Platonic dialogue ends with failure. There's never a successful definition of anything. I think that goes with the territory. It's not that Socrates isn't smart enough. And similarly with an artwork, if we ask Won Ju what this is, she's not going to tell you, oh, it's made of rotating lazy Susans, or whatever you want to call them. It's made of wood, glass, metal. The average weight of each thing is whatever. That might be helpful to know, but that isn't what it is as an artwork. Nor will we just sit around and say, oh, this is how it makes me feel. How does it make you feel? How does it make you feel? Because then you're just reducing it to its emotional effect on other people, and you're taking away the fact that an artwork challenges us. Every time we come back, we realize we missed something. And the better the art, the more we want to come back and see aspects of it we didn't know. So ultimately for me, I teach aesthetic theory every spring. I'm doing it right now. And when you bring up beauty, ugliness is often seen as the opposite of beauty. I don't think so. I think beauty and the beautiful is pleasant, the ugly is unpleasant, but they're both on the same side against what I would call literalism. Literalism is really the opposite of beauty, and knowledge is a form of literalism. It's the mass of an electron is such and such. That's a literal statement. But if you say, Homer says, Mediterranean, it's the wine dark sea. You can't really explain what that wine dark sea is in literal terms. You cannot translate a metaphor into a literal statement any more than you can project a globe onto a two-dimensional map. It's mathematically impossible. There's an incommensurability. I think the arts and philosophy are incommensurable with knowledge in that way. And I think, how do you escape literalism? Well, you can see this in metaphor. Because when you get in metaphor, unlike literal statements, I can say a pen is like a pencil. It's boring and informative. I can also say a pencil is like a pen. It doesn't matter which one you say first. But if I say wine dark sea and then say sea dark wine, those are two different metaphors. Because with wine dark sea, you've got a sea with wine qualities, and sea dark wine, it's a wine with sea qualities. And metaphor, I think, is a textbook case of what's going on in the arts. It's showing a rift between the object and its qualities that you don't get with literal statements, where an object is treated as a bundle of qualities, which is what the British empiricists thought in philosophy, David Hume and others. You can't do that in the arts or in philosophy, in my opinion. I'm on the other side of it. And what you're doing here in this piece, to get back to your piece, is you're creating all kinds of cuts between the object and its qualities. First of all, you're isolating the shadow of the thing, which is giving us a hint of the tectonic structure of the thing. So that's wonderful. By rotating it, you're giving us another rift between the thing and its qualities, because phenomenology in philosophy was all about the fact that we're seeing different qualities of things at different times, and yet we still know it's the same thing. So that's creating a gap between the qualities of the thing we're seeing at any given moment, and then what's really underlying that doesn't change. And this is all the way back to Aristotle. He says, some days Socrates is happy, other days he's sad, but he's still Socrates. That's why he's a substance. Whereas happy is always happy, sad is always sad. And Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, rejected Hume by saying the object is there self-identical. It's just showing different qualities, sometimes opposite qualities at different times. So you're giving us that. With the dim lighting, even if these things weren't rotating, and even if there were no shadows, there would already be an aesthetic effect of the dim lighting. And I want to end with one last point that ties this to philosophy. Just hope it will be interesting. There's an old paradox in philosophy called the ship of Theseus. And And this paradox has to do with, okay, let's say you have the ship of Theseus. It was a ship that they took to the island of Delos in ancient Greece and made sacrifices to Theseus to honor him for killing the Minotaur and saving Athens from having to send 8 boys and 8 girls, I don't know, was it every year or every 4 years, to be eaten by the Minotaur. And the old paradox is, okay, at one point, one of the boards on the ship of Theseus was rotting, so we replaced it with a fresh board. And then the next year, another piece of wood was rotting. And then the next year, we replaced another piece of wood. And you can imagine that after a couple hundred years, none of the original wood was left. And so the question is it still the same ship of Theseus, even though the wood is different? And then someone says, even worse, I've been keeping all the old wood in this warehouse, and now I've reassembled them into a ship. So isn't this the real ship of Theseus? It's the original woods. And that debate has gone on for centuries without much progress. And a couple of years ago, I was asked to write about this, and what I came up with was, why should you assume that preserving detail is the way to preserve the ship? Don't you actually want to get rid of detail? Don't you want to cut a thing down to its more essential features? So I was arguing that a shipwreck in some ways is closer to the real spirit of the ship than either the material or the form. So if you look at the shipwreck of the Titanic, it's not just the human tragedy that moves you, it's also this haunting, abstract version of the plan of the ship that you've got, parts of it collapsed. And so I think you're doing a lot of that here. Something about the dimness is creating a shipwreck-like effect here that makes the thing more essential, I think, than it was. And I'm going to give one last example, which is an architectural one. Our former colleague, Jeffrey Kipnis at SciArc, wrote a very interesting article about Rem Koolhaas's failed design for the Tate Modern in London. Since you're an art crowd, you probably know all about the Tate Modern. And Kipnis was actually criticizing it, but I thought all of his criticisms were actually compliments from my point of view. He was saying that basically Rem Koolhaas sees a design brief for a competition and he hacks away at the flesh and the muscle and the bone, and so all he's left with is a nervous system. And I find that that's good. He's giving you something like the essence of the design brief. And as if to emphasize this, the competition rules demanded that that smokestack be kept from when it was a power generating station. And as if to kind of thumb his nose at that, Rem Koolhaas in his design cut that down to just the steel structure underlying the bricks. So anything that happens in that direction, I think, becomes aesthetic. And I think you captured that in about 4 or 5 different ways here. It really fascinates me the more I think about it.
Wow, thank you. You want to say something?
Yeah. I'll just follow up on some of the view that you outlined. I think the thing that sort of I find so interesting is in relation to these objects is this rift between the object and its properties. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. What is that rift? What does the art do to? What is the relationship between the object and its properties?
Well, the first one is that often the deepest properties of objects are ones that we don't notice at first. This is what Immanuel Kant's philosophy is all about. We never stop to think, oh, everything we see is in 3-dimensional space, and it's in time that moves in one direction, and everything we see happens through cause and effect relations and not randomly. Until Kant wrote his book, we just kind of took all that stuff for granted. Well, one of the things we take for granted about an object sometimes is its basic shape. We're focused on the content, the color, or maybe what you would do if you went inside this building. And by casting a shadow, you're really separating out the structure from the object itself. And so you're dividing a thing from its structure in some way. It's calling our attention to the fact that the thing, in some sense, is its structure, and in another sense, is different from its structure. And then the fact that it's rotating means you are seeing the object from all possible vantage points. Whereas for these British empiricist philosophers in the 1700s, every second, I'm not even really the same person, right? I'm changing slightly from one moment to the next. So if a hair falls off my head, I'm actually a different person who just has a family resemblance to the one who's 2 seconds ago. And he says, if you look at a person when they're an infant and then look at them again at 90 years old, it was by a painting back then, now we have photographs, you would say you can't see the resemblance. Well, you kind of can in a way. But I'm more of the school like phenomenology, that there is an identity. And the fact that the properties of the person transmute over time, you're getting more of a view into the essence of the person. And here's an everyday example. A lot of times, let's say you know someone in high school who grew up in a religiously fundamentalist family. I knew a few people like this. Then you meet them when they're 30, and suddenly they're ardent atheists, they're hardcore leftists, they think religion is poisoning the minds of everyone. And you say, wow, they really changed. But usually they haven't. Usually the same intensity and zealotry is there that you saw in the high school version, it's just changed the contents. And examples from history, St. Paul, the sinner who becomes the saint, the persecutor of Christians becomes the textbook Christian, spreading Christianity throughout the world. Again, a zealot. And so a lot of times when you're looking at transformations in people's lives, you're missing that there's something there that really hasn't changed. Wittgenstein, one of the philosophers who people really create a divide between the early and the late Wittgenstein. I would say, in line with what I said earlier, that in the first phase, the Tractatus, he's reducing everything downward to its basic logical structure. In the second phase, he's reducing it upward to its use. So he's just reducing language in different directions. So I don't think there's a difference. I don't think there's a difference in early and late Heidegger. I'd have to look at some artists and some novelists to see if I think that in those cases. But I think it's actually rare that these radical turns in people's lives really change everything. Also with this work, you're separating a thing from its color by changing it into shadows. And normally if you look at an object, the color is very much a part of it. By doing this, you're cutting a rift between the object and its colors. So there's all kinds of things going on there that do that. And for me, that's really the heart of what aesthetics is all about. Why is that so important? Well, we all know that aesthetic experience can be much more captivating and addictive than literal experience. Maybe not for everyone, but there's something that deeply involves you about aesthetic experience. And I think what happens is, when that rift occurs between an object and its qualities, it's hard to put the object back together again. And so you really have to invest yourself in saying, okay, the wine dark sea, what is that? You're having to perform that in your mind. Whereas if someone says a pen is like a pencil, you're judging it, oh, that's true. You're not really investing yourself in a pen is like a pencil or a pencil is like a pen. You are not required to say, oh yeah, they're both long and skinny and they make dark marks on paper and they're both cheap. So anytime there's a cut made in the object itself, humans really have to invest themselves in making that happen. And I think you see this everywhere from art to architecture and any other aesthetic discipline anywhere on the map. Also in science, at times of revolutionary scientific change. So why is it that people talk about beauty in science? They always do that when they're talking about discoveries. Like, wow, Newton was wrong. Einstein discovered that space and time are curved by mass, and look at these beautiful equations. Or look at Lavoisier figured out that water is actually a compound. It's not an element. It's made of 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. These are the moments in science when we talk about beauty. And there are moments like that in the law, too, when something in the law strikes you as beautiful. An example of that for me was when President Salinas of Mexico, his brother was arrested and was charged with a crime that we don't have in the US, but that gave me an aesthetic reaction. That crime was called inexplicable enrichment, which I think is a beautiful crime. I mean, not beautiful that he did it, it's just a beautiful thing to have on the books. Inexplicable enrichment. Oh, he probably embezzled a bunch of money from the government. They couldn't prove that he did it, but the burden was on him to prove how did you get rich. And I think that should be on the books. In the US, of course, that would never happen. That's a moment where the law really struck me as, wow, that's a thing of beauty. Mexican jurists deserve a blue ribbon for that one.
Kind of going back to what you're both saying about the cutting through the object, and therefore the thing that's making the cutting is the light going through in this case. And lots of other stuff, but it's one that, we kind of point to, like, well, there's the source that's actually doing the cutting, and here are these kind of things that, for the most part, we're all familiar with every single one of these objects here. A vase, a bowl, an architectural model, and, like a kit for like a house or something like that, and so on. You can name all of them. But when the light goes through, there is, I'm not sure if I would call it essence, because there are many, many essences that are within not only the object, but the materials that make the object. And the function that that we use to describe a bowl, you put a candy in there, you put soup in there, blah, 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 blah. It's merely a mask, as far as I'm concerned, within inside the studio. So it's been wearing this mask and carrying the burden of the name, bull, vase, and so on. And through this cutting, the essence of the essences of the object now can be seen in so many. It was always there, so it was haunted. The inner side of the object has been haunted, and through the cutting, now it reveals itself in various forms, interacting with other essences, in various forms. And this, to me, is what is endlessly fascinating. And I think I have to do it with a regular, or whatever, banal, regular, ordinary objects that most people could recognize. And we can name the mask now. To unveil it is not just merely a taking off, but to kind of give it all the different facets that it has. And that, to me, is a creative act.
I should have said something about essence, because it's been kind of a controversial term since the heyday of Jacques Derrida in the 80s. And I would defend it. I think the problem with essence is when people claim to know the essence of something.
Yeah.
Because then you get mad political stuff. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't click it all the way. I'm sorry. I said that I think the bad side of essence is when people use it politically. Edward Said talking about the British Foreign Office saying that people in the Middle East and India aren't capable of self-government and therefore they need a viceroy. Or Pat Buchanan saying women just psychologically aren't cut out for the business world because they're not mean enough. This is the bad use of essence, where you identify a person with a knowable property, or replace them with a knowable property, where I think the essence is something that can never be known. My favorite example of this is, if I ask you, what's the first thing when I say Scandinavians that comes into your mind? You're probably going to say very progressive welfare states, gender equality. There's lots of positive things that come into progressive people's minds these days when I say Scandinavia. But let's go back 1,000 years when I say Scandinavians. These are marauders who raid monasteries and raid nuns and burn cities. And some people would say, oh, the Scandinavians don't have an essence, there's just a bunch of individual Scandinavians, which is eventually what Edward Said says about the Arabs. You can't generalize each Arab as an individual person. Well, yes. But when I moved to Egypt, there are some cultural differences you had best learn before you move to Egypt, because you're going to offend people. There are things they do there that we don't, and vice versa. So there is something like an essence. This is a fairly harmless one, but what are two things you don't ask American strangers? Number one, are you married? Number two, what's your salary? Those cut really close to the bone for us. Those are private things for us. In Egypt, every taxi driver is asking me if I'm married and what's my salary. Those are not considered such private things over there. They want to know if you're married so they can try to match you up with someone if you're not. So they want to know your salary. I don't know why exactly, but so you have to kind of dance around those questions. And in fact, one of my students was a telemarketer to America from Cairo at night. And he said he had to take an American culture course because his English was perfect, but he'd never been to America. And I asked him, what did you learn in the American culture course? And those were the two things. When you call someone to telemarket, don't ask them their salary and whether they're married, because that's an immediate hang-up. And so you can't say that, oh, everyone's just an individual. No, we also grow up in cultures, and there are certain things. They're not essence in the sense that they're unchanging over time, right? Pat Buchanan doesn't really know what a woman is capable of, right? That's unknowable. We just keep going through history, and you may be surprised by what the Scandinavians become, or what some other thing becomes. And so that's where I think essence becomes dangerous. When I talk about essence, I'm just talking about the thing that makes it the same thing despite changes over time. And that's often very hard to know, or actually impossible to know, in my opinion. But it lures you into trying to figure it out. What's the je ne sais quoi in this thing?
Definitely. I think I was talking about it this way, just right now, the way you're talking about it. Is this on? Is this on?
Yes.
I just had to talk close to it. Okay, yeah. I was definitely talking about that kind of essence that you were talking about just right now. Whereas not that essence in terms of a reduction, in essence in terms of like stereotype and so on. I'm really kind of thinking about this essence that, you see, this is where the language fails, right? What is revealed in, let's say, not even the object, necessarily a vase, let's say, but the quality of the way that the sand was compressed, to make the glass, and somehow it is not that it is illustrating how it's made, but there's a visual articulation of something. When you shine light through it, that there is no language to kind of describe the events that you are witnessing. You could be awed by it, be fascinated by it, and so on. So one thing that I want to kind of talk about now, when you were talking about Kant, and I'm not going to talk about Kant this way, but there's something really important to me. I saw a lecture by art historian, art theorist, Thierry Didot, on the critiques of judgment of Kant, and he used two artworks to kind of maybe have his audience understand. And first he was talking about Kandinsky when he left his studio and put his painting down, and when he came back to the studio, it was Kandinsky looked at this afresh. But more appropriate was the way he was talking about Robert Morris's the album, Untitled 3 albums. And he was kind of breaking down the way Kant talks about judgment in realizing a thing in the world. And so he was saying, first, in theory, to really kind of clarifies that it doesn't happen step by step, but he talks about first you have a sensation, right? And then you have cognition, and then there's this other aspect of knowing something that has to do with sensation, that is to say, your experience, your perception of something, and your knowing of something is in kind of conflict or kind of in play. I think he calls it kind of a free play, and this is an amazing artistic moment. And I think about this all the time. The other ones he's talking about judgment, this is good art, bad art. He also talks about interpretation or analysis of that something this references this, therefore it means this, and so on. Not so interested in the other two, but the first three, and especially this kind of a state of sensation is something that I'm like, I've always been, and then I listen to the Tom, then I'm like, yes, and that lacks language, that the state of sensation is one that cannot be reduced to knowledge, and we could describe it in terms of some kind of aesthetic terms. We also could describe it in terms of affect and what it's doing to us, but the state of sensation is something that I'm constantly interested in.
Fascinating. I read Didot's book, is it Kant after Duchamp? Yeah, very interesting. Yes, there is also a gap between sensation and knowledge, I think. Just the pure enjoyment you get from experiencing something. Heidegger always talked about objects as being tools that pointed to some purpose. And one of the most interesting critiques of that came from Emmanuel Levinas in the 60s, when he pointed out that food isn't equipment for nourishing unless you're in a hard labor camp, as Levinas was during World War II after he was captured. And there's just a kind of surface enjoyment of things that we shouldn't ignore, and then this became very big in psychoanalysis through Jacques Lacan, this jouissance, the fact that there is a surface to things and not just a deep meaning. You also mentioned something about language, and it's interesting that you should bring that up because I think the same happens in language. And interestingly, this happened not as a result of the continental philosophers that people like me studied all throughout graduate school, but in the analytic tradition. Daniel has a very good education. And originally, the analytic philosophers all thought of names as definite descriptions. So in other words, if I say Christopher Columbus, that means the guy that was born in this city and discovered America, and blah, 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 blah. But then what happens if you realize, Christopher Columbus didn't discover America? Not only were there natives here, but even the Vikings landed in Newfoundland 400 years before Christopher Columbus. Does that mean we stop calling him Christopher Columbus? Because after all, Columbus was defined as the person who discovered America. No, that's not what we do. We say, this is still Christopher Columbus, but he didn't discover America. So a name turns out to be something different from a description. A name, according to Saul Kripke in the early 1970s, means you're pointing at one thing rigidly. It's kind of like, that's the object. It doesn't matter how it changes. If you ask people on the street in America, who was Albert Einstein, like 53% say he invented the atomic bomb, which is just false. He warned Roosevelt that Hitler was building one. He wasn't even involved directly in the project. And so people are wrong, but they still know who Einstein was. They just are mistaken about one of his properties. And for that reason, Kripke thinks in order to understand who a name refers to, you have to follow it historically back to the original name. And that led him to the paradox that if we discovered what looks like a unicorn fossil buried, we still couldn't say they were unicorns. Because we couldn't know, even though it has the properties of a unicorn, we couldn't be sure that that's what people in the medieval period were talking about, this buried unicorn in bones. It might be something different than what the skeletons look like. So yeah, this is, I think, one of the great discoveries of the analytic philosophers, that language has this gap built in, the difference between naming someone and describing them, or any object, actually.
I wonder if we might, I want to talk about your video a little bit with that. And in particular, I think the sound is turned off right now, but I'm sort of particularly interested in the sound. So maybe first off, since maybe not everybody has seen it, I believe it is in part footage of you putting together some of these sculptures. And then over the top of that, you sort of have this small camera that's going around some of the objects. And then we can hear it. And you hear this sort of feedback kind of sound. And then it becomes clearer and clearer, and we are able at some point to hear the text that you're reading, which is from Proust. Is that all right? Now it's the reverse of this very famous piece from Alvin Lucier called "I'm Sitting in a Room," where you start with a text, and he talks about that he's sitting in a room, and that's amplified and then recorded, and then amplified again to record, et cetera, until you have this sort of just noisy recording of feedback. You sort of have this sound just of the environment, and without the sort of substance at all, without the meaning of the words at all. So I guess the first thing that jumps out to me is why were you interested in reversing Alvin Lucier's process, beginning with this this feedback sound and focusing it down to the language?
I mean, one kind of practical, one answer is like a practical one, the one that has to do with it's the very end, like minute 39 or 40. Or it starts more like minute 35-ish, and then we go backwards, and at the very end, the last thing we hear is relatively clear sound of her, and then it jumps right back in a loop. So I was thinking about a loop. How to compose sound in a way that could lead to the middle, then to the end, that would loop right back into the first frame, and then we hear her saying the same sentence again, over and again, actually, just one time, again. So the sound really has to do with, and yes, there's this kind of noise, and he is at the end, whatever generation, 39, 40, 50, or something like that. It's noise in a sense that we cannot hear at all what it is he's saying, but we are hearing the frequency of the room, and it's musical, and so I was really interested in how language then becomes connected to something that we don't comprehend in just the language, the way we could comprehend language, but that we could feel, and we could kind of have some kind of connection to that is not a cognitive experience, or in this case, a narrative experience. I think, yeah, you're pointing exactly to this moment right now. We can kind of hear her a little bit. Another thing that is happening with the soundtrack is Proust, one of the last things he did, after many, many years of being in his house and not going out at all, is he had asked Celeste Alvarez, who was his housekeeper, but also a transcriber and helped him write the last volume. He had asked Celeste Alvarez to invite the String Quartet of Paris at the time and play a composition by César Franck. And so I took the exact composition that was played and I stretched it. So I forget the number, but I made a minute into 2 hours or something, and I reversed it, because we're going towards the end. And so what you're hearing, just a minute or two before right now, is just a musical, almost eerie, almost haunting kind of sound that was already there. what I do is I messed with it in the way that the light is messing with the object and the effect of the object onto the wall. So I really kind of see the sound, especially towards the end of the video, very close to the shadows. That there is, that something has been stretched and sometimes reversed. You don't recognize it. It's always in there, in the object.
I have one last question I want to ask you about this work. One of the things I admire about it is that all of these dioramas, or whatever you want to call them, clearly belong to the same family or same style. They're architectural, they're not from the present, there's something historical about them. And yet there's an amazing amount of variety, and you don't really repeat yourself. And I'd like to know how you managed to do that, what the process was for planning the different sorts of displays.
I'll tell you like not really in detail, but what I just did was I went shopping, I went to flea markets. A lot of objects were given to me. I've been working on this, a friend of mine, actually my studio assistant at the time, was like, oh, I have a lot of objects, and so on. And also I was thinking about the way Proust describes certain objects, the doorknob or even the spire of a church. So there are a lot of these kind of factors that were there. And then I made the objects in the studio, a combination of things I make and things I found were given to me. Again, keeping in mind, knowing that I want to have some kind of shadow play, knowing, but not settling in on anything. And so for many months, I want to say 6 to 9 months or so, I created an inventory, and I kind of like categorized them. All the trees here, all the churches here, all the interiors here, and so on. And from there, I started kind of like putting things together. Again, compositionally. Oh, this one's tall. This one is opaque. I know what the shadow will do of this translucent material, so I do onto the opaque. It's very like kind of step by step in a way, kind of decisions and compositions that I made. Again, knowing that it will create a certain kind of environment that is related to a Proustian sensibility, but also knowing that, also I was keeping in mind birth of cinema. This became very important to me, and it's still, I think about this all the time. From Bergson to Einstein to who else do we name? They're all contemporaries, right? So this is a time when we as species were kind of for the first time looking at moving image, and of course this in the Proust writing, is in Berson's thinking and writing. I think there are more people we could name that's really influential to one influential, but also are symptoms of moving image.
Of course, that's one of Bergson's chief insights, is that time is not like a cinema. It's broken up of individual frames. And that's a debate he had under the table with Bertrand Russell, who said, no, it is. Bertrand Russell thought we are individual frames of time, that we change slightly in each one, whereas for Bergson, time cannot be cut into units, it's a continuum, it flows. And memories all kind of blend together. And so yeah, that was in the air. I don't know who in psychoanalysis was most involved with this, but there must have been someone.
I think somebody called me the year, but interpretation of dreams.
Oh, right, 1901, 1900, 1900.
Okay, there you go. There's another one.
Right, yeah, right. The way time works in dreams, Freud does talk about that. Yeah.
Are we inclined? Oh.
Yeah, I know. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thanks to the Night Gallery, thanks to Won Ju for
Thanks
such
to
a wonderful
Lena
show.
and everybody who set this up in this amazing place. That was really kind of another place. But yeah, is this time for questions?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, of course, thank you, Graham. Yeah, so I think we can, it's a good place to stop and pause for questions. I don't know, is there a mic that goes around, or we can get moving?
If I
Or I guess
could
they're-
take the notes.
They're wires.
Anyone?
I'll ask a question. Proust changed my life too. So if you could just talk a little bit about, you were talking about the moving image. And I wondered how you think of objects like Elstier's paintings or the little phrase as opposed to these objects you've chosen.
You wanted me to talk about the objects I've chosen? The objects I've chosen and?
And if you see Elstier, the painter in Proust, or his paintings, objects, is the little phrase that plays so throughout the novel, is that an object? Where does the art pieces fit in with these objects?
I mean, one thing for sure is that I was hoping not to have any direct connection to any kind of content of the In Search of Lost Time. You know, and yes, there are descriptions, and there's all these narratives that's happening, and one thing I was very conscious of is not to illustrate it. I'm sure it comes through in a subconscious manner in some sort, but there is no connection as far as, at least I didn't want there to be, but to, again, create a world in which there is some kind of a Proustian sensibility. I hope that answers the question, I guess, in a very simple way, that I want to not make a connection at all.
Well, I do get the sense that, that it's going in both directions, right? There's decision to avoid literalism, go back to Graham's word, and at the same time, moments of anchoring, because, you do have these slides, they're stills from films that were made on the basis of Proust's writing. There is a slide of the Vermeer painting that Proust actually talked about, right? So there are these anchor points, I feel, and at the same time, possibly I guess you could say that they're not essential. And we came here yesterday with my brother, and kind of just unloaded all this information, and then he was wondering, well, how do people know any of this stuff, right? Is it written somewhere? Do we have access to it? And then you said, well, it's perfectly okay if you don't know any of that stuff, right? So the moments where a specific citation or quotation is made, that then just becomes an aesthetic effect for a lot of people, right? What do you say? It can operate at different levels. You can recognize it or not recognize it, but ultimately the aesthetic experience, it's not the same, but it's similar, right? I guess I was pushing back against the sense that you were saying that nothing was specifically derived from or pointing to Proust, because there are moments, right? The obsession with the steeple and whatnot.
Right, there are moments, and so for example, in the Vermeer, it was like, oh wow, this is, any kind of, anybody who's an artist or familiar with art history, I think would recognize that the image of the painting, the transparency of the painting that's there. My decision was to double it, so that yes, there is an anchoring, and anybody who's read a little bit of Proust, he does talk about that particular painting and the yellow patch. I think it's on the roof or something. I was looking for it. But yes, that yellow patch becomes really, really important. But so my decision was to not use it, but to double it, do it twice. So there's an image, the print is on the transparency twice. I think this is how I made certain formal decisions. Yes, anchoring, I hope, is not, what's the word, one that is stable. There is a reference, of course, and there are many, many references. The church spire that he talks about, and I love that, might be my favorite part of Proust, when he is going on this winding road, and he sees this church that's there. He gets obsessed, like this does with his bedroom and doorknobs and stuff. But he's obsessed with the spire, and at every turn, the spire looks different. And that all these differences that he is perceiving is one that exists in this thing that obviously not moving, he is moving, and so on. And so there are many versions of spires in this work. That's another way to kind of I dealt with the things he describes and what is happening here. Then of course, then there's the shadows. But yes, I would agree, of course. But also, that's where I was like, oh yeah, make a conscious effort to not illustrate. Well, you do it twice, and do another image of it.
One last thing here. It is interesting that, Proust is known as a great describer of things, right? A poetic, imaginative describer. So what's often happening in the novel is an object is receiving focused attention and is described in language. It's converted from a thing into thought via these words, right? And then there's almost like this reverse operation that you perform, where you've got the word concept, it gets translated back into a thing. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. I mean, this is what's sort of interesting, and in a certain way, that whole thing can be taken away from any specific understanding of Proust, and we don't really need to know how each one of these things connects to an episode of the story, right? These are almost like starting points, or they give a certain kind of license, but they're not put out there as things to be read necessarily and anchored in an outside text. They're not allegorical in that way, right? But this operation of, forward, reverse, how does literature get converted into an artwork? Literature and art often have a pretty contentious relationships, certainly in the modern period, where literature is seen as almost the enemy of art because it's so prescriptive, right? To avoid any kind of storytelling, narrative, etc. This is a different way to go about it, because there is a book, there is some literature at the point of origin. It's also, there's these complicated processes of how to make something out of it. At the end of the day, the book can almost be discarded, I would say.
I would agree with that, definitely. I mean, just in general, no matter what project I'm working on, I need an excuse. I really, and not that, I mean, what a beautiful excuse, right? Marcel Proust and his writings, but I need an excuse. And yeah, maybe not totally discarded, but yes, at some point, especially by the time, after research, after more reading, and not that one happens, one after the other, but, at some point, I have to let the Proust kind of be in the back of my mind and let the things themselves come forward. I don't know, so what Jan is asking, and it's really hard for me to answer, one that has to do with, there are things in the world, and a writer, one that is like a very narrative writer, such as Proust, makes another thing, called, literature or novel, and then now I take from that, right, am I kind of summarizing your question, and what is happening here, how do I don't know, I mean, it's not that I don't know, it's really, really hard for me to articulate what that is and how it exists here. I think maybe Kevin might have an answer to that question, is that right? Do you have the answer to this question?
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me.
Or anybody here, like those that are kind of interested in how literature functions in visual art.
I thought, since Jan mentions that, I kind of circled back to the first time I saw this stuff and you were talking about Proust. I thought of Benjamin's discussion about Proust and that being cognitive memory and the play between a sort of visceral memory. And for me, that points back to this discussion between perceiving and reasoning. You talked about Kant and stuff. And so it points back to this play with aesthetic experience. So I don't know if that particular discussion of Proust informed some of the idea of memory, experience, description, right? But the visceral memories and cognitive memories. There's a rift there, but together they produce this other thing, which in the end is writing or or. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I feel like that is something to add to this way of approaching art.
I was actually thinking of a counterfactual exercise, and imagine that instead of being inspired by Proust, you were inspired by either James Joyce or Franz Kafka. And maybe the Kafka one's a little easier, because why isn't this a Kafkaesque work? I think partly because we're on the level of perception and the shifting of perception and memory, and I don't feel threatened in here. Of course, if it were a Kafka-inspired show, it'd be somewhat menacing somehow. And so I think what you would have, instead of rotating separate scenes, is you have them all assembled into a kind of threatening city where unusual things are happening. And then with Joyce, I see Kafka as the surrealism as Joyce's Dada in some ways. And so what would I don't know what a Joycean version of this would be like, but it would be, again, less perceptually oriented and more oriented towards trying to put together this jumble of signs and trying to figure out what they mean. But this is definitely a Proustian work, no question.
Okay, so just kind of based on what you said, one thought I had in mind addressing what you're asking Anna about literature and visual art, specifically my art. In reading something, in reading a story, the way time is used as a tool is very different than a visual experience. I don't know what I'm doing, in terms of like when I'm taking proofs and how we read something into this, but that there is a difference, maybe is what I'm trying to kind of figure out. That, and that's why this is Proustian. And here, I think everybody experienced this, you come into this space and you just kind of, there's this kind of immediacy. You just kind of swallow. Well, first, after your eyes adjust a little bit, and you see the shadows, there's this kind of immediacy that is, I guess in terms of like temporal thinking, it's a compression of some sort that you don't get with language and how something gets unfolded in line and reading, and this kind of a linear time that happens with reading from left to right in our culture and so on. But here we have this compression, and then over time something gets decompressed or unfolded, maybe closer to reading or closer to how knowledge comes into you via reading. One thing that's really amazing about Proust is that he really plays with this idea of compression. What's the opposite of compression? Expansion. In such a structurally complicated way that this character is inside, or these characters is inside of Madame. For example, his love object they're all fragments of his mother. There are so many ways in which things get compressed and unfolded, and that happens after you have read something, read his work linearly. Now, there's no answer. I don't think I'm answering in a maybe a clear manner, other than like kind of explaining how I see how literature can be compared to the visual experience that you're having over here.
Since you mentioned the love object, I noticed the name Albertine has not been spoken once today. Is she here anywhere?
She are in multiple places. But she's also, well, she's in the image, but so is Gilbert, so is Mama, so is Aunt Leonie, so many of these kind of characters, but not only people, places. Cambrai, I wonder, is also another stand-in for Cambrai. Is this Auntie Cambrai? Who is in Cambrai? One of his relatives that he goes to visit, right? Is in Cambrai. So these kind of places, things, objects, sensations, these are all kind of like, they're not metaphors. There are stand-ins, or I don't know, a facet of one another, and so on. Yeah. Yes, Gilbert is the one. The green one is also Gilbert and Albertine. The one that's just touching the tree.
For me, Albert Zine is one of the most haunting characters in all of literature, and it's for two reasons. First of all, he's never really sure about her sexual orientation, right? And well, he's not sure about his own either, I think, but in particular about hers. And so this entire multi-volume pondering over Albert Zine, at the end you're left with the sense that it was a waste of time on his part. And then the other one is her death, which to me is one of the most shocking, because it's right in the middle of one of those long Proustian paragraphs, and you're not expecting anything like that, and suddenly, bam, there's an event. She's got thrown off a horse into a tree, very brutal death. Her appearance here is a little more understated, right?
Yes, there are very little figures relative to other objects here. So yeah, it's true. But the thing that happens with text ordered is innocent, and figures you can recognize, there's a danger. And I really wanted to keep away somehow of lots of repetition of a lot of figures. I mean, there aren't enough. But, okay, maybe I do want to answer this by one, and it's going to happen in about 10, 15 seconds. So there's Albertine. But yes, the female figures are stable over here, and text really kind of make you rest. But there she is coming forward. Her shadow, if you're standing over there, you recognize the shadow I'm talking about on the object. And you see the shadow of her hand reaching forward before you see the silhouette. Does that make, I don't know, I think you missed it, maybe. There's another place where that happens. And I really wanted, yeah, you kind of see it now as a purple figure back there. And so I wanted her to appear and disappear and appear again and so on. And you just, depending on which way the platform is rotating, you can see her hand first reaching out, and then you see the rest of her body. So yes, I was kind of really, there she is again, thinking about something that we immediately gravitate towards and make you rest, how to stretch that, how to fragment that.
Hi, Won Ju.
Hey, where are you?
Hi. I was just wondering if you could speak to the use of vessels and the portals that I see happening, like the vessel is in the actual jars and bowls, but also the church steeples, the houses, even the small chair being like a vessel for a body.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of, there's a portal in terms of like the actual sculptures and the projections on the wall, but also a portal into, I think a lot about the light boxes at the end that, the body of the vessel, the light boxes have the photo of Man Ray with Proust on his deathbed, and kind of that also being a space for transformation and just, also.
You're speaking a little bit about the portal or the vessel metaphorically, but more you're speaking about physically, literally. There's an actual empty space, right?
Yeah, and I mean in both ways, and,
Yeah.
The alchemical connotations of the vessel of transformation. I feel like there is, big life and death stuff here.
But one more thing I would like to also kind of figure out in this way is like the portal of the space that is reflected onto, these prints, right? That's another kind of a portal too. I think there is something really attractive about gaps or negative space or space you don't have physical or visible access to. The one that where your imagination, the kind of where your imaginations can be activated as a result of an empty space that you don't have physical or visible access to. And that there's no figure sitting on the chair. I think this becomes kind of like loaded and potent. Not towards any kind of conclusion, but that you're denied of a figure sitting on the chair, or that you cannot maybe see a little bit of like some negative space, but you don't have complete access to it, visible access to it. There is consistency that I'm really interested in. What that means, I don't know. I really don't know, but there's something very attractive about this. And maybe it has something to do with that, not having access, that this thing has a space in there, this thing may be a hole or whatever, the inside of the architectural model or something like that. And that invisible space gives agency to the object that we will never know, that might reveal itself in some other ways, but for the most part, the viewing subject, we're denied of this. Yet there is a connection that might activate your imagination of some sort.
Yeah, in a way, the denial of access to the space kind of clarifies what that space is for.
Sure, yes, yeah. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much.